For a long time, this question sounded ridiculous. Could Rimuru surpass Veldanava? It didn't even seem worth discussing. After all, we're talking about the creator, the being responsible for the existence of the world itself, the entity who stood above dragons, above demon lords, above almost everything that exists in Tensura. That's why, for years, many fans considered this comparison impossible. But as the light novel progressed, something interesting began to happen. The stronger Rimuru became, the less impossible that question started to sound. And that leads us to a much more interesting discussion. Can Rimuru truly surpass Veldanava? Or is there a limit he will never be able to overcome? To understand this debate, we first need to remember who Veldanava really was. Because many fans know his name, but very few truly understand what he represented. Veldanava wasn't simply a powerful character. He was the origin of almost everything. He created the system that governs the world. He gave birth to extraordinary beings. He shaped the very foundation of reality itself. That's why comparing someone to Veldanava isn't simply a discussion about strength. It's something much bigger. We're talking about the absolute peak of existence. And for a very long time, it seemed impossible to imagine Rimuru reaching that level. But there's one detail that completely changes the conversation. At the beginning of the story, Rimuru grows in a fairly traditional way. He defeats stronger opponents, acquires new skills, gradually evolves. Everything follows a pattern that makes sense. But eventually, that changes. And it changes dramatically. Because there comes a point where Rimuru's evolutions stop being simple power boosts. Instead, they begin to change the entire scale of comparison. At first, he was compared to adventurers, then to demon lords, then to true dragons. And eventually, something strange happens. The normal standards are no longer enough to measure his strength. And that's when the first serious question appears. Maybe Rimuru is moving toward a level that only a handful of beings have ever reached. The first major clue comes from Ciel. Because Rimuru's greatest advantage was never raw power alone. It was his ability to continuously evolve. And Ciel takes that ability to an absurd level. She analyzes, optimizes, combines abilities, finds solutions that should be impossible, and removes limitations that once seemed absolute. The result? Rimuru doesn't simply grow faster than everyone else. He grows exponentially. And that creates a fascinating problem. How do you define the limits of a character who keeps breaking every limit that existed before? But even then, there still seemed to be a massive gap between Rimuru and Veldanava. Or at least, that's what many believed. Because Veldanava possessed something no one else had. Absolute authority. For a long time, that was considered the ultimate barrier. The reason nobody could ever surpass him. But as the final events of the light novel unfold, that certainty begins to disappear. Why? Because Rimuru stops merely gaining power. He begins influencing concepts that once seemed completely unreachable. His control over energy. His ultimate skills. His mastery over increasingly complex phenomena. All of it pushes him closer to territory that once belonged exclusively to Veldanava. And that changes the entire discussion. Because the question is no longer, can Rimuru get close? The question becomes, how far away is he really? But there's another detail that's even more impressive. For much of the story, Rimuru reacts to events. A problem appears, and he finds a solution. But in the later volumes, that dynamic changes completely. His influence becomes so enormous that he no longer simply participates in the story. He begins shaping it. Kingdoms change. Wars change. Civilizations change. The balance of the world changes. And that feels strangely familiar. Because that same ability to shape reality around him is exactly what made Veldanava so unique. Not merely his power, but his influence over the world itself. And the further the story progresses, the more Rimuru begins to display that same characteristic. But does that mean he has already surpassed Veldanava? Not necessarily. Because there is one important difference. Much of what we know about Veldanava remains shrouded in mystery. Many details remain incomplete. Many limits have never been fully explained. And that makes any direct comparison extremely difficult. At the same time, there is one thing we cannot ignore. The Rimuru of the later light novels reaches such an absurd level that the discussion itself no longer feels impossible. Something that would have sounded ridiculous in the early volumes has now become a legitimate debate among fans. And that alone says a lot. So, Can Rimuru surpass Veldanava? The most honest answer is, maybe. The evidence suggests that he has approached a level that once seemed completely unattainable. His growth has surpassed nearly every known character. His abilities continue to evolve. His influence continues to expand. And his potential appears to have no clearly defined ceiling. But as long as many of Veldanava's mysteries remain unanswered, it is impossible to say so with complete certainty. What we can say is something even more interesting. Very few characters in the entire history of Tensura have ever come this close to the discussion. And perhaps that's the greatest proof of how far Rimuru has come. What do you think? Has Rimuru already surpassed Veldanava? Is he still below the creator? Or will he never truly reach that level? Let me know your opinion in the comments.